Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again. This time we're going to make a fantasy style tree just like this one. Let's open up a new element and get started. The first thing I want to do is create some templates for branches. I'm going to use the curve tool to lay out some general branch-like shapes. We'll get these a little more realistic and less curvy later. I'm choosing a very dark color and I'm going to make 3 slightly different curves. I'll just show you the first one to save time. I have the curve tool here. I will edit the tool by holding L1 and pressing square. Then I will pull the curve tool out about the length of a branch and make it narrow on one end. I'll then adjust the Bezier handles into a roughly branch-like shape. And lastly, I'll make the base a little more narrow like a real branch. I'll repeat the process a couple of times and end up with this. From here, I'm going to use the smear tool with sphere shape. Color is still the dark green that we used for the curves. Surface snap needs to be turned on. I will then drag the spheres up the curve shape, pressing D-pad down along the way to decrease the size of the tool. I'm going to do that 3 times for each curve, which will net us 9 different branches. This will keep costs acceptable. You can do more if you like, but it will be more expensive in terms of graphics thermo. Okay, all 9 are done, and I'm going to select the Move tool and then delete the curves from the sculpt. By the way, if you hadn't already noticed, all of this is occurring inside a single sculpt. Then I'll separate our branches out to see what we have. If you're not happy with one, you can simply delete it or redo it. If you have an issue like a weird end, you can always edit that out later. None of these are perfect and they can always be adjusted once we have them in place on the tree. At this point we have all the branches separated and we want to make a trunk. There are lots of different ways you can do this. I'm going to smear spheres. I'll start with a relatively large sphere in the same dark green we've been using. And it doesn't matter if this shape is all that great, we just want to lay down a roughly trunk-shaped lump we can build on. Some of the smears I've made like this were pretty good right off the bat. This one is a lot thinner than I want, so I'm going to smear some spheres onto it the same way we did while making the branches. I'm not being careful at all here, partially because the style of the tree we're going for doesn't demand it, but also because we're going to adjust most of this later anyway. I'll show you one more smear and then we'll skip ahead for the sake of time. That's done, and I'm going back to the Move tool so I can start placing the branches on the trunk. You can arrange these any way you like, but for the largest and lowest branch I'm going to pick one that's fairly thick to better match the trunk. I'll scale that up and we'll bury it in the trunk. We want the whole thing to be exaggerated, not worrying about realism so much. This is a big weathered oak out in a magical forest somewhere, not the Japanese maple in your neighbor's backyard. I'll place each of the major branches sufficiently spaced out and successively rising on the trunk. For each of those 3 main branches, I'm going to take one of the remaining 6 branches we originally created, and I'll place them as vertical branches to fill in the middle space. Your configuration will probably be different. I'm trying to fill in as much space as possible with as few branches as possible. Then I'll take the remaining 3 and add them in a similar way, but as lateral branches rather than vertical. And that completes the basic trunk and branch setup, and here's what we have so far. Now I'm using the Stamp tool, sphere shape with some soft blend, and I'm going to blend the joints between the trunk and the branches so the transition is less jarring. This is a little tricky. You want to get into the tree far enough so that it's not obvious, but at the same time obvious enough to make a difference. Also, surface snap is off for this because you want to be able to move these beneath the original surface. I'll do that for all the major branches. You can do the others too if you like. I skipped it to save time and because the higher parts of the tree aren't as much of a focal point. While I have the stamp tool handy with some blend turned on, I'll go ahead and lay out the base of the trunk and the above ground portion of the root system. I'm going to pull the shape out to a more oblong spheroid and then jam it into the trunk wherever it's already protruding. So that's finished and looks real nice above the floor. We'll address the underside later. Now I want to work on the branches. Still using stamp in a sphere, but this time I'll use a negative shape. All I'm trying to do here is keep lines from being too straight. I'll give one side of the branch a bend here or there to keep things more natural looking. I concentrate mostly on the main branches, but I would say use this wherever you feel like things look unnaturally straight. We'll fix this issue partially regardless of the shape later, but this will give us a better foundation. Here I'm working with a negative cylinder using smear tool. I'll impart some spin to it by flicking the surface of the touchpad on the DS4. I'm surface snapped and I'll drag the smear up the trunk, decreasing size as I go with the down D-pad button in order to create a furrow. And then I'll repeat this process whenever it seems like a furrow is fitting. The form of the trunk and branches is complete. Now we'll start adding the bark. For this, I'm using surface snapped smear with rounded cubes in a medium brown. I have a largish cuboid. I'm going to set it tumbling by flicking the surface of the touchpad on the DS4 like we did with the furrows. I'll start at the base of the trunk and smear upward, decreasing in size with down D-pad as we go. I'm starting at the farthest root sections and working my way in. I'm pretty sure you can do this however you like and it will turn out similarly. You can also start small at the top and then increase in size as you move down. We'll keep doing that and filling areas in. Generally, I would avoid the furrows. That will give you a deep cut that looks like a mossy burn scar. But you can fill some of that in and it looks fine. It's kind of hard to mess this technique up once you get the hang of keeping your hands steady enough to maintain a continuous line. For the branches you can do the same thing, but it requires a little more skill with the motion controls. If you're finding that keeping the brush on the branches from the trunk is too much of a challenge, leave those for later when you can zoom in more. It's important to remember that if you mess up one of these smears, you can simply undo it and try again. At the same time, it's important to remember that you won't be able to undo one shape edit, so if you have any corrections to make, you'll have to do that with a negative stamp. Now we're zoomed in on a branch to make it easier to deal with. If this is still beyond your comfort level, you can zoom in further and do small sections. As long as you're laying the smears down in relatively consecutive lines, it will turn out fine. If you look up near the top right, you'll see I messed up. This is an old battered tree. It's going to look uneven and raggedy. It's fine if you have minor mistakes. For the branches, especially the parts higher up, you don't have to worry as much about coverage. The lower parts are the parts that will be noticed most, and some of the upper parts will be obscured by the canopy. We'll keep smearing and then jump ahead some. With all that smearing, you're bound to mess up and not notice. You can either edit your mistakes out with negative stamps or improvise. We have a big clump of mistakes here. I'm going to connect this all to the branch and then it will look like part of the tree died or broke off. Mistake corrected. I finished smearing the bark on. Now let's address the underside of the trunk, which is still a bunch of spheres. I'll use a large negative stamped sphere in dark green with quite a bit of blend and hard blend on. Sometimes one edit will do, sometimes you'll need a few smaller ones around the edges. You can also do this with hard blend off and it gives some interesting results, but it's trickier to use. We've gotten rid of too much bark near the underside, so let's smear some more on. And that does it for the sculpting on the trunk and branches. Now let's paint. accentuate our contours and add some other colors for more visual interest. I have a dark red-orange color and I'm adding it to undersides and some of the darker recesses of the furrows. I'm tumbling the brush for fun. It isn't necessary, but you do want surface snap on for this. Opacity is fairly low and you don't have to be careful with this. We're simply adding a darker tone to already dark areas and some color. Now I'm going to choose a dark brown with low opacity and no blend, and I'm going to darken all of the areas between the bark on the lower portions of the tree to make them stand out more. In general, I like to use a cone shape for a brush and we'll have surface snap on. Since we want to get into the cracks, we'll want our brush to be fairly small. Anywhere it looks like there's a dark line, I'm going to paint, and that will bring that line out more. I'm also going to cover the undersides of various things to emphasize the parts above. This is another thing that doesn't need to be perfect. The great thing about Dreams is that undo button is always there. However, for this, if you feel like you've made a mistake, I would encourage you to fail big before undoing anything. Keep pushing and working the mistake. See if you can make it work. Sometimes it will, and you'll end up with something you never would have done on purpose, and that will add variety to your work and also help you grow as an artist. But hey, sometimes what you did just outright sucks, so that's why it's nice to have that undo as an option. Okay, I'm going to go all around the tree and darken the cracks, mostly on the lower parts, but trying to blend it in upward so you don't have a jarring discontinuity. Also, if you're a beginning artist and are having a tough time, by all means don't think this just sprang forth from me. First, notice that this is very much an iterative process. Look at the steps we're taking. Each step makes the final product better and better. Keep working toward your end goal. Maybe you do get to a point where what you made is junk and giving up on that is a good idea. But remember, the final product is layers upon layers, so keep adding and see where it takes you. And of course, it will take some practice. Very few people produce a masterpiece right away. Not that this is a masterpiece, but you get what I'm saying. Okay, the darkening is complete and you can see that made a pretty big difference. Now we're going to add some highlights. For this, I'm going to use a muted yellow with high opacity and some blend. I'm going to add that to a bunch of different raised areas and that'll make them pop. Go big and fail big. Personally, I don't like the way this turned out, but I do like that I took the chance and learned something along the way. Above all else, keep in mind the theme. This is a fantasy tree, so it can be more toony and less realistic. Not every piece of art you produce has to be the greatest thing you've ever made, and ultimately its usefulness is determined by the audience and not you. So even if you don't like it, cut it loose and see if anyone wants to use it. Highlights are done. Let's use a technique by Saku's mind and tweak the bark. I'm going to switch the fleck type to expressive, comb it vertically, and then darken the interior color of the sculpt to give the surface some detail closer up. Now it's time to build a canopy. I've been messing with logically built canopies and you can see that in my 5-minute tree video, but we're not going to do that here. I'm smearing with random green surface snapped. I'm going to keep the shape small and just scatter it everywhere around the top of the tree. Using this technique, you'll want to attack it from several angles, including from above, and try to add laterally and vertically. Right here I have a flat part I want to rectify. In order to do that, I need to rest my brush on the end I want to extend and then pull outward. If you're unsuccessful with something like that, you can try to use tentacle snap and then surface snap around the result of that. After you're done with that, there will likely be stray spheres everywhere. Use a negative stamp to clean those up. You can shape the canopy around the tree at this point. I bring it up from underneath to show off the branches. Then go around the whole thing and get rid of strays that look weird. Then we'll use the sculpture detail tool a bunch of times to lower the cost and loosen it up so that our emissive is large when we change fleck types. We'll go into style mode and apply the splat fleck type, then crank impasto in the sculptures menu. I like to use two fleck types on trees like this, so I've copied the canopy and I'll apply dots fleck type to this one. It is possible to have more than one fleck type on a sculpt, but I generally like to use two sculpts for the canopy to fill in any thin spots. I felt like I overdid it on the highlights, so I'm going into the trunk and branches sculpture menu and adding some medium brown, and that mutes the highlights and the dark parts. And that's done. In this video, I've hopefully showed you some useful sculpting techniques and ideas. Start to finish, this tree took me about an hour, which isn't bad for a sculpture that isn't rushed. Upcoming videos will be about City Streets kit, extending my Bring a Scene to Life playlist, and I'm also hunting around the Dreamiverse for a talented relative unknown I can highlight, like I did with Same Housing and Max 17. I haven't forgotten about 2,000 subs, I'm working on that as well, but that is all for this time. Until next time, I'll see you in the Dreamiverse.